My only son. There are sentences that don't hurt when you first hear them. They just sit there, quiet, waiting, and then, minutes later, they detonate. I was standing in my father's dining room, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, at a dinner he'd called important, without explaining why. Around the table sat my stepmother Denise, her son Tyler, 26, my stepbrother of 11 years, a decent enough guy I'd never had a real problem with, and a man in a gray suit I didn't recognize, sitting a little apart from the rest of us, a leather folder closed in front of him on the table. My father stood up to make introductions, the way he always did when someone new was in the room, a little formal, a little proud, always performing the role of patriarch with a capital P. He gestured to Tyler first. "This is my son," he said. "My only son, Tyler. I want you to sit in that moment with me, because I did, for a long time, standing there holding a glass of water that had gone warm in my hand. My only son. I am not adopted. I am not a stepson. I am my father's biological child, his first child, the one who carries his exact last name, the one whose birth certificate has his signature on it. I grew up in his house until I was 14. I have his nose. I have his stubbornness. I have 31 years of being, definitionally, unambiguously, his son." And he had just introduced my stepbrother, a young man he'd known for 11 years, a young man he was not related to by blood at all, as his only son, to a stranger in a suit, with me standing 4 feet away. I remember exactly what I was wearing. I remember the exact weight of the water glass in my hand, condensation collecting under my fingers. I remember that Denise had made a roast, and the smell of it was still hanging in the room, warm and ordinary, completely at odds with what had just happened 4 feet from the oven. Some part of my brain, even in that first frozen second, was cataloging every detail of the room, the way you do when you sense, before you can name it, that you are about to need to remember this moment for a very long time. I did not say anything. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what comes later. I have spent my entire adult life not saying anything in that family, absorbing small cruelties like that one, telling myself I was being too sensitive, that it was probably a slip of the tongue, that my father surely didn't mean it the way it landed. So I stood there, and I smiled, the way you smile when something has just quietly wounded you, and you don't want anyone to see the blood. And the dinner continued. I found out, over the next 20 minutes, what the dinner was actually for. The man in the gray suit was a notary. My father had some documents to finalize, something about the house, something about the business. He was vague about the specifics in that breezy way he had when he didn't think details concerned you. He wanted witnesses. He wanted it done properly, with everyone present, a little ceremony around it, the way my father liked to make even ordinary paperwork feel like an occasion. And near the end of dinner, the notary opened his folder, and my father slid a stack of papers across the table, and he said, "All right. Let's get this squared away." And the notary looked around the table. And he looked at his paperwork. And then he looked directly at me. And he said, "I'll need to see your ID, please." Not Tyler's. Mine. I froze for a second, confused, and I said, "I'm sorry. For what, exactly?" And the notary, glancing down at his documents, said, matter-of-factly, the way professionals say things that are about to upend someone's entire evening, "You're listed here as a required signatory and witness. Tyler isn't listed on this document at all." The table went very quiet. I looked at my father, and for the first time in a very long time, I watched something flicker across his face that he could not fully control. Fear. Stay with me, because to understand what was actually in that folder, and why the man my father had just called his only son wasn't even named on the paper in front of him, you have to understand exactly what kind of family I'd grown up in, exactly what my father had spent 11 years quietly building, and exactly how close he came, that night, to getting away with it completely. It starts 11 years earlier, on the day my father remarried. How Tyler became the favorite. My parents divorced when I was 13. It wasn't ugly exactly. No screaming matches, no custody battles that made the news. It was just quiet and sad, the way a lot of divorces are. Two people who had stopped being able to make each other happy, slowly untangling a life they'd built together. My mother got primary custody. My father moved into an apartment across town, and for about a year, things were what you'd call normal difficult. I saw him every other weekend. He tried, in his way. It wasn't great, but it wasn't nothing. Then he met Denise. And Denise came with Tyler, who was 15 at the time, 2 years older than me. A quiet, watchful kid, who'd had a hard few years himself, his own father having left the picture entirely. No contact, nothing. I want to be fair here, because this story isn't really about Tyler, and I don't want to make him the villain of it, because he wasn't. He was a kid who needed a father, and my father, for reasons I would only fully understand many years later, was extremely willing to become one for him. Almost immediately, I noticed the shift. It wasn't dramatic at first, it was small things. My father started using we a lot when he talked about weekend plans. We're going to the game. We thought we'd try that new restaurant. And it took me a while to realize the we almost never fully included me the way it used to. I was invited, technically, but I was the guest at an event that had already been planned around someone else's preferences. Tyler liked sports. I didn't, particularly. And my father, who had always been a sports guy, suddenly had a built-in sports buddy, someone who actually wanted to go to games with him, who understood the rules without explanation, who high-fived at the right moments. I liked reading, mostly, quiet things. And my father had never quite known what to do with that in me, even before the divorce. And now that there was an alternative sitting right there at the dinner table, he simply stopped trying as hard. It's a strange, specific kind of grief, being slowly replaced by a stranger, while everyone insists nothing has changed. Nobody sits you down and tells you it's happening. There's no single moment you can point to. It's just an accumulation, 1,000 tiny redirections of attention, 1,000 small choices about who gets asked first, who gets remembered, who gets the benefit of the doubt. By the time I was 16, I dreaded the every other weekend visits in a way I never told anyone. Because how do you explain that dread to people? My dad has a new favorite kid. And it isn't me. And he seems happier that way. It sounds petty when you say it out loud. It sounds like jealousy, like something you should just get over. I did try to get over it. For years, I told myself I was imagining the whole thing. But there was one specific memory that I've never been able to explain away, no matter how hard I tried. I was 17, at a family barbecue at my father's house. One of the bigger gatherings, extended family, neighbors, the works. And an old family friend, someone who hadn't seen us in years, came up to my father while I was standing right there, and asked, casually, gesturing at both me and Tyler, "So which one's yours again?" And my father, without missing a beat, without a flicker of hesitation, pointed at Tyler. I stood there and watched him do it. And then, a half-second later, some part of him must have registered what he'd done, because he laughed, awkwardly, and corrected himself. "Oh, sorry. Both, I mean. This one's mine too, biologically, ha," gesturing at me like an afterthought, like a footnote to the real answer. Nobody else seemed to notice. It was a small moment, fast, forgettable to everyone but me. I have never forgotten it, not once, in 14 years. That was the first crack. I want to give you one more memory, because it's the one that actually hurt more than the barbecue, even though it was quieter. My 18th birthday fell on a Tuesday that year, an ordinary school night, and my father had told me weeks in advance that he wanted to take me somewhere nice, just the two of us, to mark it properly. I held on to that promise all month. I told my friends about it. I picked out a shirt. 2 days before my birthday, he called to say something had come up. Tyler had a big game that same night, a real one, playoffs, and my father really felt he needed to be there for him. And could we maybe do my dinner the following weekend instead? We did do dinner the following weekend. It was fine, it just wasn't my birthday anymore, and some part of me understood, even at 18, that when it came down to an actual choice between the two of us on a single specific night, I was the one who could be rescheduled. That was the second crack, and after that one, the dread just settled in and stayed. Reasons not to see it. I want to talk honestly about the years between that barbecue and the dinner with the notary, because I spent most of that time doing something that I think a lot of people do when someone they love keeps hurting them in small, deniable ways. I made excuses for him. I told myself Tyler had it harder than me. No father of his own. A rockier home life before Denise met my dad. And that maybe my father was just trying extra hard to make sure Tyler didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. That felt generous. That felt like the kind of thing a good person would think. And I wanted, badly, to be a good person. The kind of son who didn't keep score. I told myself that my father simply had more in common with Tyler. Sports, mostly. It wasn't personal, I told myself. It was just chemistry, the kind of easy overlap two people sometimes have, and it didn't mean he loved me any less. Different doesn't mean less. I repeated that to myself so many times it started to sound true. I told myself I was too sensitive. That the which one's yours moment was an old man fumbling a casual question at a loud barbecue, not a window into his actual feelings. People misspeak. People get flustered by unexpected questions. I built an entire architecture of reasonable explanations, and I lived inside it for years, because the alternative, that my father genuinely preferred another man's son to his own, was too painful to hold directly. And here's the thing about that kind of self-deception. It works, for a while, as long as the evidence stays small and spaced out. A comment here, a slight there, each one, alone, dismissible. It's only when you finally step back and look at the whole pattern, laid end to end, that the shape of it becomes impossible to unsee. I didn't step back and look at the whole pattern until I was much older. Because doing that meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. In my 20s, the pattern kept building, quietly, in the background of an otherwise ordinary life. Tyler was invited to more things. Tyler's achievements got bigger celebrations. When Tyler graduated college, my father rented a private room at a restaurant and gave a speech that ran 15 minutes and made 3 separate people cry. When I graduated, 2 years earlier, from a better school, with honors, my father took me to a diner and told me he was proud of me, between bites of a burger, glancing at his phone twice during the conversation. I told myself, again, that I was reading too much into it. Diners can be meaningful too. It's not about the venue, I told myself, it's about the sentiment. I believed that, or told myself I believed it, for a long time. What I couldn't quite explain away, though I tried, was the language. Over the years, in small, casual ways, my father had started referring to Tyler, with a possessiveness he almost never used with me. My boy Tyler, that's my son's doing, right there, pointing at some accomplishment. And when people who didn't know our family structure would meet us both, my father had developed an odd habit of introducing Tyler first, and more warmly, and introducing me second, with a kind of formal correctness that felt, increasingly, like an obligation being fulfilled, rather than a relationship being celebrated. I noticed all of it. I filed all of it away, and I kept building reasons why none of it meant what it obviously meant. There is one more memory from those years I want to give you, because it's the one that, looking back, should have ended the excuse-making a full decade earlier than it actually did. I was 24. My father had a minor health scare, nothing life-threatening in the end, but frightening enough at the time that the whole family gathered at the hospital while doctors ran tests. And I remember sitting in that waiting room, genuinely terrified, and overhearing my father, once the all clear had come, and the mood had lifted, joking with Tyler in the next room, about getting his affairs in order eventually. A throwaway line, the kind people say to lighten a scary moment. Except he said it directly to Tyler. Not to me, sitting 15 feet away. He said it to Tyler, laughing, and Tyler laughed back, and the two of them talked, easily, about a future neither of them had any real reason to be discussing together, while I sat in a waiting room chair with my heart still pounding from thinking I might lose my father that day. I told myself, again, that it meant nothing, that it was just proximity. Tyler happened to be standing there, that's all. I built the excuse in about 4 seconds, the way I'd gotten so practiced at doing by then, and I filed the memory away with all the others, unexamined, unresolved. Until the dinner with the notary, when the pattern I'd spent 14 years explaining away suddenly had a legal document attached to it, and explaining it away was no longer an option. What my father actually built. Before I tell you what was in that folder, I need to explain what my father actually did for a living, because it's the missing piece that makes everything else make sense. My father owned a mid-sized construction and property development company. He'd built it from almost nothing, starting in his 20s with a single crew and a truck, growing it over 3 decades into something genuinely substantial. Commercial properties, residential developments, a real business, with real employees, and real value. And I had grown up, in a strange half-formal way, inside that business. As a teenager, even during the difficult years after the divorce, I'd worked summers there, starting with genuinely menial labor, sweeping sites, running supplies, and gradually, as I got older, moving into more substantial roles. By my mid-20s, I was handling real responsibilities for him: contract review, some of the financial oversight, relationships with a few key clients he trusted me to manage. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, not to brag, but because it matters for what comes later. I was genuinely good at the business, and my father knew it, and he used that fact constantly, leaning on me for problems he didn't want to deal with himself, trusting me with things he didn't trust to anyone else on his actual payroll. Let me give you a sense of what that actually looked like, because handling responsibilities can sound vague, and I want you to understand the real weight of it. 3 years earlier, the company had nearly lost its biggest commercial client over a contract dispute that could have cost my father close to $1 million in penalties. He'd called me at 11 at night, genuinely panicked, and I'd spent the following week essentially living at the office, renegotiating terms, smoothing over a relationship he'd damaged through his own carelessness, and ultimately saving the account entirely. He'd hugged me in the parking lot afterward, actually hugged me, something he rarely did, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you in this business. I don't know what I'd do without you in this business." I held on to that sentence for 3 years. I thought it meant something permanent. I thought it was a kind of promise, even if he never used that word. Tyler, on the other hand, had never worked at the company, not once. He'd gone into a completely different field, something in marketing, unrelated to construction or property entirely, and while he was, by all accounts, doing fine in his own career, he had no history with my father's business at all. No sweat equity. No years of learning the client relationships, the contracts, the specific hard-won knowledge of exactly how that company actually functioned. Which is why, when I finally understood what was in that folder, it made no sense to me on a practical level, before it even fully registered on an emotional one. The document the notary had brought that night was related to a restructuring of ownership in my father's company, specifically, a plan to formally name a successor and heir to the business, ahead of my father's eventual retirement, which he'd been talking about, vaguely, for a couple of years. And the plan, as it existed on paper that night, named Tyler. Not as an equal partner alongside me, not as a beneficiary of some portion of the business which, while it would have stung, might have at least made a certain sense given the family structure. The document, in its original drafted form, named Tyler as sole heir to the company's controlling ownership, with a role and a title that my father had apparently been planning to hand him. I was not mentioned in that draft. Not as an heir, not as an owner. My name did not appear anywhere in the succession plan for a company I had spent a decade of my life helping to run. The only reason my name was on any document that night at all, the only reason the notary needed my ID, was a completely separate, smaller matter buried later in the folder. My father needed me, specifically me, to co-sign a witness statement confirming certain financial records I had personally overseen, because without my signature, that particular part of the paperwork couldn't be properly certified. He needed my expertise, my labor, my professional credibility, built over a decade of actual, real contribution to that business. He just hadn't planned on giving me any of the company in return. The notary's question. I want to take you back into that dining room now, because the next several minutes are ones I will remember with total clarity for the rest of my life. I remember the specific sounds: the clink of Denise setting down her fork, the faint hum of the dishwasher running in the next room, mid-cycle, oblivious. the notary clearing his throat before he spoke, a small professional habit that, in any other context, would have meant nothing at all. I remember my father's hand, resting on the folder he'd slid across the table, and how, for just a fraction of a second before the notary spoke, he had looked almost relaxed. Pleased with himself even, a man about to complete a plan he'd been quietly assembling for 2 years, in a room full of people he assumed would simply go along with whatever he'd decided, the way they always had. The notary, a professional, unbothered man who had clearly done this 1,000 times and had no idea he'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of someone's family, simply repeated himself when I asked what my ID was for. "You're listed as a required signatory and witness on the financial certification section," he said, tapping a specific page. "Standard requirement for documents of this type. Someone with direct oversight of the records needs to attest to their accuracy. That's you, according to what's listed here." "And Tyler?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "What's he listed as?" The notary glanced down at his paperwork again, flipping back a page, and said, plainly, without any awareness of what he was about to do, "He's named here as the successor beneficiary for the business ownership transfer." Different section entirely. I looked at my father. I want to describe his face in that moment, because it told me everything before he said a single word. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. Not yet. It was the specific, unmistakable look of a man who has been quietly planning something for a long time and has just watched it get exposed several steps earlier than he'd intended. "Dad," I said, and my voice had gone very quiet, "what exactly is this document?" And my father, who was, whatever else I can say about him, not a stupid man, and who understood immediately that there was no smooth way out of this specific moment, with a notary sitting right there holding physical proof of exactly what he'd planned, did something I genuinely did not expect. He tried to make it small. "It's just paperwork," he said, waving a hand, the way he waved away things he didn't want to discuss. "We can go over the specifics later. This doesn't need to happen at dinner." "It's happening at dinner," I said. "You called this dinner. You brought the notary to dinner. Explain it to me now." Denise shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Tyler," and I want to be fair to him here, because his reaction told me something important. Tyler had gone very still, and very pale, and he was looking at my father with an expression that suggested this was news to him too. Not entirely news, maybe, but the specifics, laid bare in front of me at a dinner table with a stranger's paperwork as evidence. I don't think Tyler had expected to see it happen quite like this either. "Dad," Tyler said quietly, "you said you'd talked to him about this before." "I was going to," my father snapped, and for the first time that night, I heard real anger in his voice, though I understood, even then, that the anger wasn't really at me. It was at himself, at the situation, at being caught in the gap between what he'd planned and how he'd planned to explain it. I sat back in my chair, and I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as a very long, very quiet held breath, finally releasing. Because for 14 years, I had built an entire elaborate architecture of excuses to explain away a pattern I could feel, but couldn't fully name. Tyler needed extra attention. Sports created natural bonding. Diners can be meaningful too. I had done that work, patiently, generously, for over a decade. And in the space of about 90 seconds, sitting in that dining room, all of that architecture came down at once. Because there was no generous explanation for this. There was no reasonable interpretation of a legal document that quietly wrote your entire existence out of a business you'd spent 10 years building, while requiring your signature to make it official. This wasn't a feeling anymore. This wasn't something I could talk myself out of. This was paper. And paper doesn't lie the way people do. The explanation that wasn't one. The notary, to his credit, quietly gathered his folder and said he'd give us a few minutes, and stepped out onto the back patio, leaving the four of us alone with what had just happened. And my father, cornered, finally started talking, and I want to walk you through what he said, because it's a masterclass in a certain kind of self-serving logic that I think a lot of people will recognize, even if they've never lived through this exact situation. He started with practicality. He said Tyler had more of a natural interest in taking over day-to-day leadership eventually, which was, on its face, absurd, given that Tyler had never worked a single day at the company, and I had spent a decade in it. But my father delivered this line as though it were self-evidently reasonable. When I pointed that out, calmly, I want to stress, because I was determined not to give him the excuse of calling me emotional or dramatic, he pivoted. He said that I had my own path, that I'd never explicitly told him I wanted to inherit the business, that he'd simply assumed, over the years, that I was building my own thing, and wasn't interested in staying tied to his company forever. This was, I pointed out, also strange, given that I had never once said anything of the sort, and had, in fact, spent a decade demonstrating exactly the opposite, through years of consistent, committed work. He pivoted again, and this time, finally, something closer to the truth came out, though it came out sideways, the way real truths often do when someone's cornered. He said, "Tyler doesn't have anyone else. He doesn't have a father who built something. You've got your mother's side, you've got your own thing going. You'll be fine no matter what happens with the company. Tyler needs this. You don't need this the way he needs this." And I sat with that sentence for a long moment, because it was, in its own twisted way, the most honest thing my father had said all night. He didn't think I needed love, attention, or inheritance the way Tyler did, because I had a mother who loved me, and a life outside of him. And because I had those things, because I'd survived, and built a life, and didn't appear to be struggling, my father had quietly decided, over years, without ever discussing it with me, that I could afford to be given less. It never seemed to occur to him that, "She'll be fine without it," and, "I don't need to give her anything," were not the same sentence. That I had built a stable life despite years of being quietly deprioritized, not because that deprioritization didn't matter. That resilience is not the same as not being hurt. That surviving something well does not mean it didn't happen. Denise, to her credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable throughout this entire exchange, and at one point said, quietly, "Robert, I told you this needed to be handled differently." Which told me this wasn't news to her either, and that some part of her had seen this collision coming, and tried, apparently unsuccessfully, to steer him away from it. And Tyler, who I still don't consider the villain of this story, finally spoke up, and said something that surprised me. He said, "Dad, I can't sign something that cuts her out. I won't. I never asked for this. I didn't even know the paperwork looked like this until right now." I watched his hands as he said it, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles pale. He wasn't performing outrage for my benefit. He looked genuinely sick, the way you look when you realize you've been standing, unknowingly, on the wrong side of something ugly for a long time. And I believed him. I still believe him. Whatever else was true that night, Tyler had not orchestrated this. He had simply been the passive beneficiary of a preference my father had been building for over a decade, mostly, I think, without even fully admitting it to himself, until a legal document forced the shape of it into the light. I did not sign anything. I want to tell you what I did in that dining room, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, and I think it surprised everyone at that table, including, in some ways, myself. I did not scream, I did not cry, not yet. That came later, alone, in my car, and I'll be honest about that too. I did not storm out, though every instinct in my body wanted to. I asked my father one question. I said, "How long have you been planning this?" And he hesitated, and I watched him calculate whether to lie. And then, to his very limited credit, he told the truth. "About 2 years," he said quietly. 2 years. 2 years of Sunday dinners, of casual conversations, of my father sitting across from me, discussing the business, asking my opinion on contracts, relying on my judgment for decisions that mattered, while, the entire time, quietly working with lawyers to write me out of any future ownership of the thing I was helping him build. 2 years of a slow, deliberate erasure, dressed up as an ordinary loving relationship. I stood up from the table, and I said calmly, "I'm not signing anything tonight. Not the witness statement, not anything. If you need my signature on financial records I personally oversaw, you can have your lawyer send them to my lawyer, and we can discuss it through proper channels, like the strangers you've apparently decided we are." My father started to say something. I think he was going to try the anger approach, the disappointed patriarch voice he'd used on me my whole life to make me back down. And I held up a hand, and something in my face must have told him this was not a night that voice was going to work. "I'm not going to make a scene," I said. "I'm not going to yell at you in front of a notary you invited into your house. But I want you to understand something clearly, right now, before I leave. You didn't just make a business decision tonight. You told me, with paperwork, in writing, notarized and everything, exactly how you actually see me, after 31 years, after a decade of work in your company, after every 'I love you' you've ever said to me on the phone, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it. I've done that for 14 years. I'm done." I picked up my coat. I said a quiet goodnight to Denise, who looked like she might cry. I nodded to Tyler, who looked genuinely miserable, and who said, "I'm sorry, I really am." And I believed him. And I walked out of my father's house, into the cold, and I sat in my car for a long time, before I could make my hands steady enough to drive. I want to tell you what that hour in the car was actually like, because I think it matters more than the composed version of events I gave inside that dining room. I cried the way you cry when something has been held back for 14 years, and finally has permission to come out. Not delicate crying, the ugly kind, the kind that makes it hard to breathe, that comes in waves you can't control or predict. I cried for the 18-year-old who didn't get his birthday dinner. I cried for the 17-year-old standing at that barbecue, watching his father point at someone else. I cried, mostly, for the version of myself who had spent so many years being so generous, so understanding, so determined to give my father the benefit of every doubt, and who had just watched all of that generosity get repaid with a legal document that quietly wrote him out of his own inheritance. At some point, my phone buzzed. A text from Tyler, sent, I think, while I was still sitting in that driveway. It said, "I really am sorry. I didn't know it was like that until tonight. I hope you know I never asked for any of this." I read it 3 times before I could make myself believe it. And eventually, I did believe it, because it didn't sound like guilt performed for an audience. My father wasn't there to see it. Nobody was watching. It sounded like a young man who had just watched his own stepfather do something ugly, and didn't know what else to do except say so. I didn't reply that night. I wasn't ready. But I kept the message, and I read it again later, in the weeks that followed, when I needed reminding that Tyler wasn't the enemy in this story, whatever else was true. Eventually, I steadied my hands enough to drive. That was not the end of the story. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are waiting for the moment I get revenge, the moment I win, the moment my father gets what's coming to him. It's coming. But it took longer, and it looked different than I expected that night. Because the truth is, I didn't leave that dinner as someone plotting an attack. I left as someone finally, completely done, pretending not to see something that had been true for 14 years. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't revenge. It's simply refusing, ever again, to make yourself smaller, so someone else's comfortable lie can stay standing. What I found, when I finally looked, in the weeks that followed, I did something I had never allowed myself to do before, in 14 years of quiet self-deception. I looked at the whole picture, clearly, without excuses. I hired my own lawyer, not to attack my father, not yet, but simply to understand, in plain language, what my actual rights and position were. I wanted facts, not feelings. I had spent 14 years drowning in feelings I didn't trust myself to interpret correctly. I wanted something solid. I remember that first meeting with the lawyer clearly, because it was the first time in the whole ordeal that anyone had looked at my situation without any emotional stake in it at all. No history, no guilt, no old loyalty pulling at the edges of their judgment. She read through what I'd brought her, the notes I'd taken, the general outline of the succession document as I understood it, and she said, plainly, regardless of how this gets resolved emotionally with your father, you have a real defensible claim here, based on your documented contribution to the business. That's not a feeling. That's a fact you can act on if you need to. Hearing a stranger say that, someone with no reason to flatter me, no reason to take my side out of love or guilt, did something important. It confirmed, from the outside, What I'd spent 14 years unable to fully trust from the inside. That I wasn't imagining this. That my sense of injustice wasn't an overreaction. That the facts, laid out plainly by someone with nothing at stake, matched exactly what my gut had been telling me all along. And what I learned, over those weeks, complicated the story in a way I hadn't expected. Because it turned out my father's plan wasn't purely about favoritism, though favoritism was absolutely part of it. There was something else tangled up in it too, something that took me longer to untangle, and which, oddly, made me feel slightly less like a victim of pure cruelty, and more like a casualty of my father's own unresolved guilt. My father, it turned out, had spent years quietly carrying an enormous weight of guilt about Tyler's biological father, a man who had, from what I could piece together, been genuinely absent and damaging in ways that went beyond simple abandonment. My father had, somewhere along the way, decided, in that particular way people decide things about themselves without ever examining them closely, that he had a moral obligation to make up for what Tyler had lost, in a way that went beyond ordinary stepfather affection. He had built a story in his own head where being generous to Tyler was a kind of penance, a correction of a cosmic wrong. And because I already had a father, him, biologically, whatever his flaws, he had quietly decided, without ever discussing it with me, that my need for that same generosity was somehow smaller, less urgent, already accounted for. It didn't excuse what he'd done. I want to be very clear about that. Understanding a person's reasoning is not the same as accepting it, and I did not, and do not, accept it. A father does not get to quietly triage his own children's needs based on a private calculation he never bothers to share with the child on the losing end of it. If he'd wanted to be generous to Tyler, genuinely, admirably generous, there were 100 ways to do that which didn't require erasing me from a legal document. But understanding it did something important. It moved my anger from a colder, simpler place, my father doesn't love me, to a more complicated, more survivable place. My father made a series of selfish, cowardly decisions, over years, because he never had the courage to have an honest conversation with either of his sons about what he actually owed each of them. That distinction mattered. It still matters. And with that understanding, and with my lawyer's guidance, I started to build not a plan for revenge, but a plan for clarity. I wanted the truth on the table, permanently, in a form nobody could quietly walk back or smooth over at the next family dinner. What I actually asked for. About a month after that dinner, I went back to my father, alone, no notary, no Denise, no Tyler, just the two of us, at his kitchen table, in the middle of the day. And I told him what I wanted. Not what I wanted to take from him, what I wanted to hear, clearly, in a way I could finally, fully trust. I said, I don't want revenge, I want the truth, out loud, once, and then I want you to actually fix this, or I want to know clearly that you won't, so I can stop hoping you might. And I asked him 3 questions. I asked, do you love Tyler more than me? And he sat with that for a long time. And then, quietly, he said, no, I don't think I do. I think I've just been more comfortable with him. He's never made me feel guilty about anything. Being around you sometimes reminds me of the divorce, of things I did wrong, of years I lost with you that I can't get back. Being around Tyler doesn't carry any of that. It was easier. It was easier. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me a long time to understand what it actually meant. My father hadn't necessarily chosen Tyler because he loved him more. He'd chosen the version of fatherhood that came without guilt attached. Loving me honestly meant confronting his own failures. The divorce, the years of gradual absence, the ways he'd let a new family slowly crowd out the old one. Loving Tyler was simpler because Tyler's story didn't implicate him in anything. He could be the hero of Tyler's story. In mine, he was, at best, a complicated supporting character with real damage on his record. He had chosen comfort over honesty, for years, and called it love. I sat with that for a long moment, at his kitchen table, in the flat afternoon light, and I felt something strange happen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of grief that was different from the anger I'd been carrying for a month. Because underneath the excuse, underneath it was easier, was a genuinely sad admission My own father had found it too painful to be around me without confronting his own failures. And rather than doing that difficult, necessary work, he'd simply built a life that let him avoid it. I had been, in some backward way, too important to him to be comfortable around. That didn't make it hurt less, but it made it hurt differently. I asked my second question, why did you let it go on for 2 years without telling me? And he said, and I believe this was true, because I knew what it would sound like, once I said it out loud. I knew it would sound exactly like what it was, and I think some part of me kept hoping I'd find a way to make it sound better, before I had to actually say it to your face. He never found that way, because there wasn't one. And my third question, the one that actually mattered for what came next. I asked, what are you going to do about it now? Fixing it. Imperfectly. I'm not going to tell you that my father transformed overnight into a perfect parent, because that's not what happened. And I think stories that claim total transformation are usually lying to make themselves feel better. What actually happened was slower, messier, and more real. He revised the succession plan. Genuinely revised it, this time with both Tyler and me at the table, with our own separate lawyers present, with everything laid out plainly, instead of arranged quietly behind closed doors. The final structure gave me a real, substantial ownership stake in the company, reflecting, finally, the decade of actual work I'd put into it, with a path toward eventual full leadership, given my history and demonstrated ability. Tyler received a smaller financial interest, appropriate to a family member without the operational history, along with my father's genuine, separate commitment to help Tyler in other ways, some direct financial support outside the business, help with a venture Tyler actually wanted to pursue in his own field. It wasn't equal in the simple, split down the middle way some people might expect. It was fair, in the more complicated way fairness usually actually works, reflecting what each of us had actually built, actually earned, actually needed, laid out honestly instead of quietly decided in private, and revealed only when a notary happened to ask the wrong person for ID. I want to tell you about the day we actually signed the revised paperwork, because it was almost a mirror image of that first dinner, and the difference between the two moments told me everything about how far we'd actually come. We met at the lawyer's office this time, not my father's dining room. No surprise notary, no ambush. Tyler and I had both reviewed everything in advance, separately, with our own counsel, exactly as it should have happened the first time. When it came time to sign, the lawyer read out my role plainly, full name, full title, full ownership percentage, and there was no confusion, no stranger needing to double-check whose ID belonged where. My name was exactly where it should have been, because for once, someone had actually planned for it to be there from the beginning. Tyler signed his own section a few minutes later, and when he was done, he looked over at me and said, quietly, "This feels better, doesn't it?" It wasn't really a question. I nodded, because it did. And my father apologized, properly, finally, not the deflecting almost apology from that dinner table. He said, plainly, that he had spent years telling himself a story about being generous to Tyler that let him avoid the harder, more honest work of actually repairing his relationship with me. That giving things to Tyler had felt, to him, like an easy substitute for the difficult conversations he owed me about the divorce, about the lost years, about all the small ways he'd let a new family eclipse an old one, instead of finding a way to hold both. "I used him to avoid you," my father said, and it was, I think, the most honest sentence he'd ever said to me. That's an awful thing to admit, but it's true. Being generous with Tyler didn't cost me anything emotionally. Being honest with you would have cost me everything I didn't want to face. I don't think our relationship is fully healed. I want to be honest about that too. 14 years of quiet deprioritization doesn't disappear because of one hard conversation and a revised legal document, however sincere. There's a wariness in me now that I don't think will ever fully go away. A small, permanent awareness that my father is capable of choosing comfort over me, if the stakes are ever high enough and the excuse convenient enough. But there's also, now, something that wasn't there before: honesty. A real accounting of what happened, spoken out loud, agreed to by everyone in the room, instead of buried in private calculations I wasn't allowed to see until a stranger's paperwork accidentally exposed them. Tyler and I are actually closer now than we were before all this, strangely. We had our own conversation, separately, a few weeks after the kitchen table meeting, and he told me he'd felt trapped, for years, in a role he never fully asked for, the golden replacement child, a title that came with its own quiet pressure, its own guilt, its own complicated weight. He told me something I hadn't expected, that being treated as the favorite had never actually felt good, not really. It felt like being handed a debt he didn't understand and couldn't repay, a constant, low-grade pressure to be grateful, to perform the role my father needed him to play, to never ask too many questions about why things were arranged the way they were, because questioning it might have meant losing the one stable father figure he'd ever had. I used to lie awake sometimes, he told me, wondering what would happen to me if he ever found out I wasn't actually as good as he needed me to be. He'd been carrying his own version of an impossible weight the entire time, just shaped differently than mine. We're not close, the way brothers who grew up together are close. But we're honest with each other now, in a way the whole family wasn't, for a long time. What paper can't lie about? So let me tell you what all of this taught me, because if you've stayed with me this whole way, some of this belongs to you now. The first thing I learned is this. The excuses you build to protect someone you love are often more elaborate and more exhausting than the truth would have been. I spent 14 years constructing reasonable explanations for a pattern I could feel but didn't want to name. Sports created natural bonding. Diners can be meaningful too. He's just more comfortable with Tyler. Each individual excuse was small enough to swallow, but building and maintaining an entire architecture of excuses, year after year, is its own kind of labor, exhausting, invisible, and ultimately protective of the wrong person. If you find yourself working that hard to explain away a pattern of small hurts, ask yourself honestly whose comfort you're actually protecting. It usually isn't your own. The second thing I learned is this. Actions arranged in private will eventually meet daylight, and daylight does not negotiate. My father spent 2 years quietly building a version of the future that erased me, confident, I think, that he'd find the right moment and the right words to make it land softly. He never found them, because there weren't any. And in the end, it wasn't a confrontation or an accusation that exposed him. It was a stranger, doing his ordinary job, asking a simple procedural question. The truth doesn't need you to go looking for it forever. Sometimes it just shows up, on its own schedule, in the most mundane possible form. A notary with a folder, asking for the wrong person's ID, and it doesn't care how carefully you tried to arrange things to avoid that exact moment. The third thing, and this one surprised me the most, understanding why someone hurt you is not the same as excusing it, but it can still change how you carry it. Learning about my father's guilt over Tyler's absent biological father didn't erase what he'd done to me. It didn't make the succession plan acceptable, or the years of quiet deprioritization fair. But it did move the injury from a simple, cold place, I am not loved, to a more complicated, more survivable place. My father made cowardly choices to avoid his own guilt, and I paid the price for a debt that was never mine. That distinction doesn't heal everything, but it makes the healing possible, in a way that a simpler, colder story never could have. The fourth thing I learned is specifically for anyone who has ever been quietly compared to a sibling, step or otherwise, and come up short in ways nobody would say out loud. Being resilient is not the same as being fine. My father's entire justification rested on one idea. I would be fine without the things Tyler needed. Because I already had a stable life, a loving mother, a foundation Tyler had never had. And on the surface that's even true. I was, by most measures, fine. I had built a good life. I had survived years of quiet deprioritization without falling apart. But surviving something well is not the same as it not costing you anything. I carried the weight of being the one who'll be fine for years, and that weight was real, even if it was invisible to everyone else. Even if it never showed up as a crisis anyone had to manage. People who cope well are often, quietly, given less. Because their pain doesn't demand attention the way someone else's crisis does. If you've ever been the strong one in a family, the one nobody worried about, I want you to know that reputation is not proof that you didn't need anything. It's often proof that you learned, very young, not to ask. And the last thing, the thing I hold on to most. You are allowed to stop pretending not to see something, even after years of practice at pretending. For 14 years, I was very good at not seeing what was directly in front of me. I had trained myself into it, out of love, out of hope, out of a desire to be generous and unbothered, and easy to be around. And it took a legal document, cold, plain, undeniable, to finally give me permission to stop. You shouldn't need a notary and a folder full of paperwork to give yourself that permission. If some part of you has been quietly building excuses for years, for a pattern that keeps hurting you in small, deniable ways, I want you to know you're allowed to stop building them. You're allowed to look at the whole pattern, laid out end to end, and call it exactly what it is. My father called another man's son his only son, at a dinner table, with me standing 4 feet away. And an hour later, a stranger with a folder full of paperwork asked for my ID. Because underneath all the warm words and the easy affection, and 14 years of quiet redirection, some smaller, more honest part of the truth had already been written down. I was still the one whose name was actually needed. I just had to stop pretending not to notice that it mattered. I think about that a lot, actually. The strange mercy hidden inside that specific coincidence. Because if the notary had never needed my ID, if the paperwork had simply gone through as originally drafted, quietly, at some later date, with no dramatic dinner table moment to force the issue, I don't know how much longer I would have kept building excuses. Years, maybe. Possibly the rest of my life, right up until my father's actual death, when I would have discovered the truth in the worst possible way, in a lawyer's office, grieving and blindsided all at once, with no chance left to have the conversation that fixed anything. Instead, I got the conversation. Uncomfortable, overdue, and delivered by accident through a stranger's routine question, but I got it. And I got it while my father was still alive, still capable of change, still able to sit across a kitchen table and tell me the truth about why he'd done what he'd done. Not everyone gets that chance. I try to remember that, on the days when the old wariness creeps back in, when I catch myself bracing for the next quiet redirection. I got the version of this story where the truth arrived early enough to still be useful. That's not nothing, that's actually everything. I think, too, about how easily this could have gone the other way. How easily the notary could have simply asked Tyler for his ID that night, quietly, without incident, the whole plan sliding through unnoticed for another year, or two, or until it was far too late for anything but grief and legal battles after my father was gone. There was nothing inevitable about the truth finding me when it did. It was, in the end, a small, ordinary accident of paperwork, one line on one form, filled out correctly by a man who had no idea what he was about to set in motion. I've stopped being angry at the universe for making me wait 14 years for that accident. Some doors only open when they open. What matters is what you do once you're standing in the light of them. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Take care of yourself. And if you've spent years quietly building excuses for someone who keeps hurting you in small, deniable ways, I want you to know that the paperwork of your own life doesn't lie, even when the people in it do. Look at the whole pattern. You're allowed to finally see it.